Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to Forums That Matter, a community service of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Christine Howie, a member of the Forum Committee, and I'm coordinator of today's discussion, which has both remote and in-person audiences. Our topic today is learning to hate democracy, the rise of right-wing organizations. We'll have a Q&A from about 9:30 until 10. Nancy and Gary will provide mics for our in-person audience. We ask our virtual audience to put questions in the Q&A box. Also, virtual viewers can turn closed captioning on or off at the bottom of the screen. Please be sure phones are in the off or airplane or worship mode, however you choose to define that. This program is recorded and will be available in a few days on our website at uucleveland.org. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Matthew J. Lacombe is an Alexander P. Lamis Associate Professor in American Politics at Case Western Reserve University, Department of Political Science. His articles, dissertations, and books, authored, co-authored, or in progress, include titles such as Gunning for the Masses, How the NRA Has Shaped Its Supporters' Behavior, Advanced Its Political Agenda, and Thwarted the Will of the Majority. Violence and Voting in the U.S., How School Shootings Impact Elections. Weaponized Group Identities and the Health of Democracy, How Groups Can Be Good at Democracy, but Bad for It. Unexpected Alliances in American Politics, and What Billionaires Want, the Secret Influence of America's 100 Richest. Please help me welcome Matthew Lacombe.
Thanks a lot for that introduction, Christine, and thanks for inviting me here. It's great to be here. The research agenda sounds kind of dark when read all at once. The Unexpected Alliances Project is a little sunnier. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to join you this morning, and I appreciate the invitation. So today's topic is the rise of right-wing political organizations, including think tanks and other types of interest groups. The influence these organizations have and the role they play in conservative politics has really been underscored in recent years as American democracy has faced greater and greater threats and challenges. One big example, of course, comes from Donald Trump's unexpected victory 8 years ago. I can't believe it was that long ago, in the 2016 election. Trump at that time was a real political novice who seemingly didn't expect to actually win the Republican nomination that year. And as a result, had a very disorganized campaign operation during that election cycle. Trump was able to overcome that weakness in his campaign organization, however, in part because of the strong support he received from conservative-leaning interest groups, including the National Rifle Association, evangelical, religious, and political organizations, and also the Fraternal Order of Police. Those sorts of groups helped Trump build resources and mobilize support, and did so in no small part because they saw in him someone who was willing to sort of push the boundaries of mainstream politics farther to the right and in a more sort of anti-establishment direction than their longer-standing Republican ally. Fast forward 4 years, and we again witnessed and have since then continued to witness right-wing organizations seeking to advance their interests in ways that challenge the robustness of U.S. democracy and the underlying institutions associated with it. Right-wing organizations, for example, created and popularized the so-called Stop the Steal movement following Trump's loss in November 2020, which of course ominously culminated with the failed insurrection on January 6, 2021. Using overstated or just outright false claims about voter fraud as motivation, conservative organizations and think tanks then developed and promoted legislation in states around the country with the goal being to place new restrictions on voting that they believed would benefit their candidates. As Larry David learned in the most recent season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, if there are any fans of that show out there, Georgia passed a law among other things, criminalized even giving water to people waiting in long lines outside of polling locations. More seriously, these efforts have involved trying to make it harder to vote by mail or to use ballot drop boxes, which of course was particularly important during the pandemic, which was still ongoing during the 2020 election. Also, these efforts focus on making it harder to mobilize people as part of voter registration efforts, putting restrictions on what groups trying to get people to register to vote can do, how they can approach that, and also to require voter identification, among numerous other things. Ohio, in fact, is one of the GOP-led states that have passed these sorts of laws, which, again, to be clear, are often developed and initially promoted by conservative think tanks. Beyond voting-related legislation, conservative groups in Ohio, especially anti-abortion groups, also played a big role in advancing the ultimately failed attempt to make it harder to amend the state constitution via ballot initiative. As many of you likely recall, this involved holding a special election in August of 2021, which would have raised the threshold for passing a constitutional amendment via voter referendum from a simple majority to a 60% threshold. And the rather clear goal of that maneuver was to make it less likely that a majority of Ohioans would be able to enshrine a constitutional right to abortion later that fall. And really, regardless of where someone stands on that issue, the goal there was to sort of change the rules of the Democratic game in a way that would give one partisan side advantage. And say that although that effort failed, and I would note that pushing back on that effort required a lot of mobilization and effort on the part of activists, although it failed, it demonstrated a clear willingness to attempt to alter the rules of the game rather than simply trying to win within them. And that's something a lot of scholars would say is concerning from a perspective of democracy. We want to have stable rules of the game. People compete within those rules of the game rather than fighting to sort of change them for their own advantage. Rather than going through more examples of this, I want to shift now and provide a bit more context and background on all of this. The anecdotes that I've mentioned clearly illustrate the nature and the stakes of what conservative activist groups are up to. But to really understand it, we need to think a bit more about where these groups came from and why they seem more powerful and bolder than in the past. Okay, so first, and don't worry, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through boring definitions. I do want to briefly talk about what ideological interest groups and think tanks are. What counts as an interest group is actually quite expansive. So I just finished, the semester is wrapping up. I just finished a course on the topic of interest groups. And in that class, we define interest groups as consisting of any organizations that engage in political activity and that are not themselves political parties. In this broad sense, any organization that has political interest and sometimes takes action with the goal of advancing those interests can be thought of as an interest group. That includes my employer, Case Western Reserve, and any number of organizations, including, for instance, hospitals, whose primary missions are not political, but who have reason to engage in lobbying in certain circumstances. Might also include things like the American Medical Association, which advocate politically on behalf of people with the same occupation. So we can separate out institutions that are mostly focused on other things, like universities and hospitals, and that have sort of narrowly defined interests and preferences. We can separate them out from more ideologically driven interest groups. Ideological interest groups tend not to exist solely for the advancement of sort of well-defined narrow interests related to, for example, education policy or the occupational interests of a particular group, but instead are often focused on advancing shared values or political preferences that individual members hold. Ideologically oriented interest groups, they can be mass-based, that is, they can sort of function by recruiting and mobilizing regular voters, and they can also include think tanks. Think tanks don't really have traditional memberships in the sense that we would associate with something like the CR Club. On a basic level, think tanks tend to be research centers that develop and distribute ideas with the goal being to influence government policy. They're places where new political ideas and policy ideas are initially developed. Now, some of these think tanks are nonpartisan, of course, but oftentimes they're ideologically motivated. So the Heritage Foundation, for example, advances conservative ideas. And sometimes these groups work in conjunction with and are supported by business groups or citizens groups. The ideas developed by think tanks can be both policy focused, that is generated at developing specific policy interventions that government officials might decide to implement. They can also be politically focused. They can be geared at understanding how the public might be best convinced to support particular causes. Now, to be clear, ideologically oriented groups and think tanks aren't actually a new phenomenon on the right. Although their origins can actually be traced back even further into the 20th century, the conservative organizations and think tanks of the sort that we see today really began to gain momentum in the 1970s and 1980s. So coming out of the 60s and 70s, there was a belief among conservatives and elite circles that they lacked sufficient representation in US government. We can debate whether they were right in that perception, but they clearly felt that they didn't have strong representation, especially in the federal government. For more economically focused conservatives, the 1960s and 70s had produced a social and economic and regulatory context that many business leaders saw as threatening. This sort of gloomy context manifested itself in new or newly empowered federal agencies, which in conjunction with an economy that was stagnating after a longer period of prosperity, were jarring to the business community. Those agencies are ones that we might think of as good things, but that a lot of leaders in these circles didn't like. We're thinking of organizations and agencies like the EPA or OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which implemented regulatory policies related to the environment and workplace safety that many in business saw as at best burdensome and at worst a sign that the system of free enterprise was under attack. Meanwhile, social conservatives saw the sexual revolution, the proliferation of efforts to expand civil rights and liberties, and the empowerment of the federal government on behalf of those causes as threats to their belief systems. And not only did conservatives feel threatened at this time, they also felt, again, that they lacked strong representation in politics, even in the Republican Party. So in today's political environment, although there's a little bit of diversity within each party, the parties are generally what we can call ideologically sorted. Ideologically sorted is just a fancy way of saying that liberals are mostly Democrats and conservatives are mostly Republicans. Back then, however, in the 70s and early 80s, this wasn't so much the case. There were liberals and conservatives within each party, and hardline conservative activists believed that no true and pure organized conservative efforts really existed to advance their cause. They didn't think that the likes of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford were going to cut it. They wanted what they saw as true conservative leadership, leaders who would be willing to fight harder and in more sort of cutthroat fashion on behalf of a conservative ideological vision. So in light of those sentiments, an effort to build a new conservative movement was launched, an effort that was ultimately quite successful. And the reason I'm talking about it is that in many ways we could sort of say it culminated in this moment. So this conservative movement, often referred to as the New Right, when referring to the 1970s and 80s element of it, was a coalition of groups seeking to build a multifaceted movement that would unite conservatives of different stripes and channel their efforts into greater influence in Washington and greater influence within the Republican Party. Kind of wanted to take over the Republican Party. This involved the creation of math-based groups focused on single issues, such as gun rights and abortion. This was a period in which those sorts of issues, the big sort of social issue debates we associate with politics today, became a lot more prominent in politics. They would tie those sorts of groups together with both one another and with other groups focused on advancing anti-government populism of the sort that we again see a lot of today, small government libertarianism, which I would say we don't see so much today, except when it's politically convenient, and religious conservatism. So they sought to sort of wed together those strands of ideas and mobilize the constituencies that supported each of them. And they facilitated those connections between those otherwise somewhat disparate groups through the establishment of think tanks, such as the Heritage Foundation, which was founded in the early 70s, along with media outlets and other sort of formalized organizations. The New Right also recruited and supported candidates who would run on their platform. Further, the conservative movement also eventually founded the Federalist Society, which was created in 1982 as a legal organization that advocates for an originalist view of constitutional interpretation. And the Federalist Society has served as a site through which conservative lawyers can coordinate strategy, they can develop new legal doctrines, and they can aid the career advancement of conservative judges. It has succeeded at both popularizing a legal approach that is aligned really well with conservative political goals, and also, even more so, I would argue, at advancing the judicial careers of conservative judges. There was a perception at the time that not only were presidents appointing judges who were too liberal, but also that the sort of slate of potential conservative Supreme Court justices who were true conservatives committed to these principles was too thin. So this organization was really successful at building up a sort of stable of conservative judges and lawyers and really helping them advance themselves in the legal world. So this movement and the organizations associated with it contributed to the nomination and election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Reagan won office running on a platform that was pretty closely aligned with the conservative movement's primary goal. And once in office, he began to advance those goals and to sort of firm up these new political alliances. And then as the GOP remade itself in the mold of Reaganism, the conservative movement and all the groups associated with it came to sort of occupy the party's coalition. When we think of what the Republican Party is today, in a lot of ways, it's a coalition of these sorts of groups that really rose to prominence during the heyday of the conservative movement. In the years since then, as we've all observed, these dynamics have continued to develop, with the Republican Party adopting policy stances that are reflective of its allied interest groups on issues ranging from gun rights to taxation to abortion to race and policing. While the groups associated with the conservative movement have certainly experienced successes on the federal level with the current composition of the Supreme Court and the decisions that court has made as prime examples, in general, a bit less attention is often paid to their highly successful efforts on the state level. This relative lack of attention is probably mostly due to state level politics in general being given a bit less attention than national politics. There's, of course, only one national government rather than 50 state governments. And those who control the national government, generally speaking, have much more power than state level policymakers. Moreover, we've seen local news sort of decline a bit, and it's typically local news outlets that would be covering happenings on the state and local levels. So we've just all paid a bit less attention to the state level, but that has not been true of conservative interest groups. In fact, partially because the state level gets less attention, it's a place where interest groups have the potential to be particularly influential. National politics are really crowded. There are lots of political actors competing for influence, and they're also really well observed with lots of attention and media coverage focused on what policymakers in Washington are up to. On the state level, on the other hand, interest groups often find fewer opponents. They're subject to less transparency, and they discover that their resources can often go farther. Moreover, on the state level, partisan gridlock is less likely to occur than on the federal level. So whereas Washington these days is more frequently characterized by divided than unified government, especially Republican unified government, is more likely on the state level. And as a result, conservative interest groups often find allies on the state level, and those allies are often in a position to get things done. There's so much, presidential elections are very important, but often some of these sort of elite donors and groups find that even when they have some successes on the federal level, it's hard to get things done in Washington, whereas things can proceed oftentimes pretty smoothly on the state level. Further, and I think this is less known and understood, state level policymakers, especially in rural states with smaller populations, tend to have far fewer resources at their disposal than members of Congress. So in some states, state legislators aren't given any full-time staff members, nor are they paid a real salary. As a result, they tend to actually be in greater need of assistance from interest groups and think tanks than members of Congress are, because members of Congress have paid staff and access to other sort of institutionalized resources that can help them develop and promote new policies. Think about it. If you were elected to a state legislature and given no staff, you may well look to friendly interest groups for help with information pertaining to policy, public opinion, and so on. I'll talk more a bit about how that's played out on the conservative side. And then finally, it's worth underscoring that lots of important stuff happens on the state level. So yes, the federal government is more powerful than state government, but state governments oversee, among other things, policing, education, Medicaid programs, infrastructure projects. After Dobbs, they now oversee abortion. And perhaps most importantly, when it comes to democracy, election laws pertaining to both the state and the federal levels are dictated on the state level. How elections operate, who's eligible to vote, what the process of getting access to the ballot, and so on, those are all state level policies. So as a result of that, what happens on the state level matters a whole lot. And relative to their liberal counterparts, conservative interest groups have paid more attention and been more active in the nitty-gritty of state politics. In general, and there are some sort of counter arguments to be made here, but in general, the left has, over the last few decades, been more focused on trying to achieve big wins in Washington than on fighting for sort of incremental process on the state level. Meanwhile, conservatives, led in large part by the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, have gradually won big victories in states across the country, which at times have helped build momentum that eventually led to federal level wins. So basically, they have a state-by-state strategy that at first these look like small wins, but over time, if enough states adopt the same laws, that's almost like passing a national law. And moreover, the way American politics often works is that enough states sort of build momentum on a particular policy initiative, and all of a sudden it becomes reflected in how we interpret the Constitution through the Supreme Court or through what conservative justices decide. So ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, what is that exactly? Well, it's a conservative membership organization, and it's genuinely kind of fascinating. It's a conservative membership organization that can be joined both by state legislators on the one hand, and on the other hand, businesses, organizations, and individual donors and activists. So there's sort of two parts of the membership. One is state legislators, and then the other is conservative organizations and activists. So working with those corporate, organizational, and activist members, which to be clear can include other interest groups like the NRA, ALEC develops so-called model legislation, which reflects the interests and preferences of those members. So this model legislation, which again reflects the interests of its non-governmental members, is then made available to its members who are elected state legislators. Those state legislators can then introduce and support the model bills developed by the group. To be clear, when I say model bills, we're talking about pieces of legislation that are almost like ad libs. You can just sort of plug in the name of your state, introduce the bill, and you're almost ready to go. So there are a number of states that have strikingly similar state laws that were originally developed by ALEC. A former colleague of mine wrote a book called State Capture, focused on ALEC and its allied groups that I would recommend. And in it, he and his co-author at that time used plagiarism detection software that professors like me use to see if students are cheating, and basically found strikingly similar language across different states. So who are ALEC's business, organizational, and activist members? Well, ALEC doesn't disclose that, but they've been reported to include lots and lots of large companies like Altria, which is the new name for Philip Morris, Anheuser-Busch, oil companies like ExxonMobil, pharmaceuticals, health insurance companies, private prison companies, chemical companies, telecom companies, and also other political organizations like the NRA and the Federalist Society. They're sort of dues-paying members of ALEC. I will say, in light of some of the negative media attention that ALEC received a few years ago, some big companies that don't want to be associated with the conservative movement, like Microsoft, have left, but the group nonetheless remains pretty robust. So developing and promoting model bills, ALEC worked closely with state-level think tanks that are part of SPN. SPN is the state policy network. So it's a network of think tanks on the state level that work closely with organizations like ALEC. In Ohio, that includes, for example, the Buckeye Institute. They're part of the state policy network. These think tanks, they put together policy reports, they conduct data analyses, and they develop other sources of information that then inform what goes into ALEC's model bills. The model bills, to be clear, include things like regulation on telecom and tech activities, energy and fossil fuel regulations, stand your ground gun laws, which have proliferated across the country, right to work labor laws, voter ID laws, healthcare and insurance regulations, and more. ALEC has been quite successful on the state level with its model legislation being introduced and passed in Republican-led legislatures around the country. I'd say there are a few aspects of this that are notable and interesting, each of which pertain to the question of why ALEC has been so successful at doing this. How does it get state legislators to listen to it? And how does it convince its non-governmental members, those businesses, individuals, other interest groups, sort of go along with its plan? Well, I'd say there are a few reasons. First, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, many state-level policymakers lack the resources that are needed to do their job. New Hampshire legislators, for example, are given a $200 stipend per term and are not given staff members or even offices. In these sorts of situations, being given model legislation pertaining to a particular policy issue, along with a political playbook that can be used to persuade colleagues and constituents, is extremely valuable. So I have some colleagues who would argue that one way we can reduce the influence of interest groups is to actually give legislatures more money, which politically is a bit unpopular. I'm guessing many of you are not huge fans of the Ohio State Legislature, and me saying, you know, the solution is to pump more money into that probably wouldn't go over that well. But I do think there's a good argument to be made that the better resourced legislatures are, the less in need of this sort of assistance they would be. On an individual level, it's hard to actually blame people for using these resources. Second, ALEC services are highly useful for its non-governmental members, those interest groups and activists, because A, as I said earlier, their resources, their spending on politics, it tends to go further on the state level than on the gridlocked and crowded federal level. And because B, the introduction of highly similar model bills across different states provides the sort of policy continuity that would typically only be expected through federal action. And that sort of continuity in which there are similar policies across states is valuable to businesses that are active in states around the country. So basically, they can have something akin to a federal law that provides policy continuity, but they can get that done on the state level where it's easier to get their way. Finally, and related, ALEC's state-by-state approach can end up popularizing certain policies in ways that lead to wider scale enactment, which is something I hinted at a few minutes ago. So for a long time, for example, concealed carry laws and other policies that make it easier to own, wield, and use guns were fairly uncommon across the country. But then interest groups like the NRA and ALEC, working one state at a time, were able to change that. And their success ended up contributing to the Supreme Court's 2008 decision holding that the Second Amendment protects an individual as opposed to collective right to bear arms. So basically, ALEC and the NRA were able to pass sort of loosen concealed carry laws in enough states around the country that eventually the Supreme Court said, basically, this seems like an individual right. They made a number of arguments, but one of them was a majority of states have already sort of made it an individual right. So maybe our interpretation of the Constitution should reflect that. I'm not saying that that was the right decision, but that is often how constitutional jurisprudence plays. Enough states pass laws, and that ends up being reflected in how we interpret the federal Constitution. So as much of what I've said suggests, relatively recent developments pertaining to the activities of right-wing interest groups and think tanks, they're not something totally new, but can instead be linked back to decades-long efforts to promote conservative causes on the state level. So there's a sort of longer history to this, and I wanted to talk through that. Having said that, I do think it's clear to anyone who's sort of observing American politics that some things have nonetheless changed in important ways, even despite there being some longer-term continuity. The MAGA movement has created a situation in which the organizational infrastructure that I've described so far today has been in many ways co-opted by Trump and sort of pushed even further in a hardline direction. So as I noted earlier, that infrastructure was crucial to enabling Trump's election after he got the Republican nomination in 2016. And although some elite conservative actors, such as Charles Koch, really don't like Trump, the movement they collectively created nonetheless helped lay a foundation for his rise. So Charles Koch has never been on the Trump train, but he still helped create a situation that made it a lot easier for Trump to rise. Their use of inflammatory anti-system language and their willingness to engage in what we could call constitutional hardball tactics, which are actions that are technically within the boundaries of the Constitution, but that violate longer standing norms around democracy. All of these actions help prepare conservative voters for the type of right-wing anti-system populism associated with Trump. And what I mean by hardball tactics, it would involve, for example, changing the rules of how Congress proceeds, how Congress handles voting on nominations, how it handles which president gets to nominate a Supreme Court justice, and so on. Those are all things that there aren't hard and fast rules on them in the Constitution, but part of a democratic system is having certain norms, certain shared understandings of how things are supposed to work and sticking to them. Scattering those norms is something that many scholars would say is harmful to democracy. And it was really the conservative movement that helped lay the foundation for a sort of tolerance of smashing those norms. I'd say what's different now is that the leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, rather than being willing to work with the fringes of the conservative movement, is really in some ways of the fringes of that movement. So in other words, rather than the highest level of the GOP having to kind of carefully manage the far right voices in its coalition, that highest level is now cheering on those voices, providing them representation, pushing them to go even farther, especially as it pertains to their willingness to alter electoral rules and procedures and use governmental powers and offices for partisan gain. What's that?
Do the Q&A.
Oh yeah, I'm almost there. Yeah. All of this is further exacerbated by the fact that American politics are currently characterized by a situation in which partisanship and polarization are really strong, but parties themselves as institutions are actually fairly weak. So what does that mean exactly? That partisanship and polarization are strong, but parties are weak? Well, the parties themselves as organizations are not particularly very robust, actually, especially on the Republican side. So we see a Republican Party that has seemingly little influence or control over which sorts of candidates are nominated to run on its label. In other words, it's continually unable to prevent controversial and ultimately politically somewhat unsuccessful individuals from winning its primary election. A strong party would be able to gatekeep and filter out the Marjorie Taylor Greenes or Matt Gaetzes or Carrie Lakes or Donald Trumps of the world, who, to be clear, beyond harming democracy, are really not good for the party politically. The current GOP is not only unable to filter out bad candidates, but it's also unable to exert much control over them after they take office. You can see the sort of debacle that is consistently going on with Republicans trying to elect a Speaker of the House as evidence of that. At the same time, partisanship is actually currently rather strong. So partisanship, to be clear, refers to the sort of social and psychological attachment that people have to party labels. How intensely attached are policymakers and voters to parties, including how fiercely they dislike the other party. This is, of course, closely related to polarization, which refers to how sort of wide and deep the divide between the parties are. Despite parties being weak, there's compelling evidence that partisanship is strong and polarization is high. Those who identify as Republicans and Democrats are farther apart from each other than ever. And beyond that, there's also evidence those who claim to be independents, but who lean in one direction, now basically just vote for the same party every time. So polarization is high. And moreover, we also see that animosity among people on opposite sides of the political spectrum is also very high. So why does all of that matter? Well, if the parties themselves are not very strong, but partisanship and polarization are strong, we might end up, and I think we have ended up in a situation where voters, convinced that the other side is basically irredeemable, are willing to go along with some really questionable decisions made by elites who are sort of on their side politically. So when the stakes of politics seem extremely high to people, and sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not, and when politicians from the opposing side are seen as dire threats, people are less likely to hold their own side accountable for behaving in ways that harm democracy. When you can't stomach the thought of the other side winning, you're less likely to push back on politicians from your side, and more likely to sort of accept when they go along with what these sort of fringe interest groups want. Should I could spend a couple minutes talking about what might be done about all of this, or we could shift to Q&A, and maybe that'll come up then. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
I don't know if these people have questions. I know I have a couple.
Sure.
So please.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Matt for sharing his time and expertise with us. Thank you so much. I'll now turn to the Q&A session. Turn it over to the inimitable Nancy and Gary.
First question over here.
Remember, hold the mic close to your mouth.
Got it. So clearly, economic, business considerations, secular political considerations are all factors here. But to what extent would we have any of this without the influence of the evangelicals and Christian nationalists?
That's a great question. So that conservative movement that I talked about that formed in the 70s and 80s, one thing it did well that had been attempted before, but that it never succeeded, was to bring that sort of Christian right into alignment with the business organization. And we've now, in American politics, come to just sort of accept that those two big umbrellas, sort of pro-business folks, the evangelical Christians, that they sort of fit together politically. But that doesn't actually make all that much intuitive sense. So there was real work that went into figuring out how to align them with each other politically, how to bring them together. And I think your intuition is absolutely right, that had those business groups not succeeded at bringing in the Christian right, and actually, I would argue, developing the Christian right into a thing, I don't think the sorts of developments I was talking about today would have been possible, because political parties, even if they try and rig the system a little bit, they still need voters, right? And it was really that Christian right that provided a lot of voters, that provided a really politically active and intense constituency that could vote for candidates who would advocate on behalf of the policy priorities of the conservative movement. So I mostly talked about what these interest groups and think tanks have been up to, but without bringing in the Christian right as a wing of this, I think you're right. They really wouldn't have been able to succeed, because they need voters. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I was wondering, why aren't there Democratic groups or liberal-minded groups doing what Alec is doing, going into state governments and offering policies that are more leaning towards good democracy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a few reasons. One is that I think for a long time, people on the left felt like the federal government was treating them pretty well. Like things were going sort of okay on the federal level, leading up to the moment in which ALEC and this conservative movement were created. In other words, organizations like ALEC were developed because of perception among conservative activists that the federal government was sort of harming them. And then they decided to turn to the state level and win things there. I think that the left was lower to figure out that the state level was really important because they thought things were going okay. On the federal level, I think in general, there are often also certain goals just associated with liberal politics that probably are best achieved on the national level. So think about climate as an issue. We could do things on the state level, and we should do things on the state level. But that's one where federal level action is pretty important. In fact, international level action is pretty important. So I think it's also to some degree a perception, a belief that a lot of liberal goals are more likely to be achieved on the national rather than state level. But also, there have been some efforts to replicate this, and it turns out that holding an organization like ALEC together is not as easy as it sounds. And the book I mentioned, State Capture, sort of goes through the internal protocols and processes that help sort of guide the collective decisions made within ALEC. And they're pretty clever ways to sort of hold the organization together, all of which is a lead up to saying that some of the efforts on the left have failed as a result of infighting. An inability to sort of agree on which policies should be prioritized, put forth, what the sort of best strategy moving forward is. So there have been a number of reasons that this hasn't panned out to the same extent on the state level. I will be curious to see if the aftermath of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade actually ends up leading to the development of more robust state level organizations, because so much attention has now been turned to state level politics. We're all Ohioans. I think we've gotten used to state level elections often not going the way of Democrats, which makes it all the more notable that the issue referendums focused on things like abortion and marijuana as well have gone more to the liberal side, and maybe that suggests that there's more sort of organizational focus now on the state level.
We have a great question from a virtual attendee. Is there a liberal equivalent of the network of groups and organizations like you've just described as a conservative point of view?
Yeah, to my knowledge, I mean, that's sort of related to what I was just talking through. To my knowledge, there's not something that is fully comparable to this network. Although my information on that may be outdated. I mostly focused on the right. But to my knowledge, there isn't something fully comparable.
Excellent presentation, Matt. Thank you very much. I especially appreciated your animation. Thank you. Thank you so much. My question is this: I have dear friends who are evangelical Christians, active in their church on an almost daily basis, and yet on the front of their house they have a 3-foot by 6-foot Trump banner. And I wonder if academics or anyone else is studying the complete moral disconnect between the evangelical Christians and the behavior of Donald Trump with porn stars and all of his infidelities and the rest.
It really does seem like a clash, right? Even beyond the bad behavior that you mentioned, his general persona of a sort of hacky New York billionaire who's super ostentatious doesn't seem to fit with the general personification of the sorts of voters you're talking about. I don't have a perfect answer to this, but what I would say is that there's a sort of worldview associated with politics of the Christian right. And Donald Trump has spoken the language of that worldview and appealed to that worldview in a way that other candidates, even other candidates who seemingly fit better with the sort of lives that Christian folks like that are trying to live, they just haven't spoken to it to the same degree. So that's the best explanation I have, is that the way that Donald Trump talks about politics, the way he talks about the world, the way he talks about the country, sort of gives voice to some of the concerns that those constituencies have in ways that other candidates have. By the way, the same thing, it's not a lot of hands, so I won't talk forever, but the same thing applies to gun owners. So I wrote a book on the NRA and on the political behavior of gun owners. And gun owners similarly have been enthusiastically won over by Trump, despite the fact, again, that he doesn't really fit with the identity and persona that the NRA and other gun organizations sort of built around gun owners. They see themselves as average Americans, as honest, hardworking people in a way that he really doesn't fit with. But again, I think the sort of anti-government populism, the willingness to be really anti-establishment and to engage in conspiratorial thinking and to sort of advocate on behalf of tearing down governmental institutions, those are all things that sort of appeal to that constituency, even if Trump himself isn't a personification of it. Yeah.
I could address briefly.
Thank you for the enthusiastic nodding, by the way. It's always cool to have somebody on it. Yeah.
I wonder if you could address briefly the hyper-local emphasis on organizing by conservatives that really goes back to the 1980s with school boards and control of textbooks.
Yeah. So I'll admit I'm not an expert on that specific substantive topic. But I think that is another manifestation of the general push that we're talking about today. Conservatives have been really good at figuring out how politics works, who holds the power, not necessarily fighting about it rhetorically, but at realizing that it's not necessarily to win a school board election, and then all of a sudden you're given a lot of power. I think that the one thing I would add to that, beyond just noting that they're good at figuring out how the rules work, is that politics have become nationalized in ways that then feed into the hyperlocal element. So nationalization and hyperlocal seem like they clash, but if you have attention on local institutions, but you're animated by these big national things, things that happen at the national level can often end up providing sort of momentum to those hyper local efforts. So I'm thinking about, the panic over something like critical race theory. It's an example of, I would say, a nationalized phenomenon that became a sort of fear mongering tactic in national politics that then was channeled into sort of hyper local politics. And so I think that you've done a pretty effective job at taking national level concerns and then channeling them into local institutions. And if we were to criticize the left, I would say they're paying attention and they get animated, but I'm not sure that they're getting involved on the hyperlocal level in the same way. Yeah.
Matt, you mentioned the Buckeye Institute as a conservative think tank in Ohio. What are the liberal think tanks?
I actually don't know off the top of my head. If we were in class, I would say I'll get back to you next class. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if there really is. I mean, there probably are some. There were probably liberal interest groups that helped, for example, put together the ballot initiatives related to abortion, for example. But I'm not aware of something sort of equivalent to the Buckeye Institute, in part just because any liberal equivalent wouldn't have the same level of allies with power in state government. I think the Buckeye Institute is more of a concern than it otherwise would be, given the sort of stranglehold that Republicans have over the state legislature. Yeah.
Thank you. Could you name, you said you had some ideas of what could be done about that. Could you name some of those?
Sure. And to be clear, none of these are silver bullets. This is a tough situation. I think, and all of you folks would be examples of this, but being sort of joiners, being people who get involved in local institutions, even if they're not explicitly political, is a really good thing. And to the extent, and it's become harder and harder in contemporary life, to the extent that those local institutions can bring people together from different class, race, religious, or political lines, can be helpful to democracy because it builds social trust. So the example of having close friends who have a big Trump banner maybe cuts against my point here. But even in the premise of that question, you said you respect these people in many ways, they're close friends. And I do think in general, the greater the extent to which we have ties that cross boundaries, the less likely we are to, in both directions, sort of view the other side as some horrifying sort of monster. And I think the sort of social trust associated with getting involved that way can be good. I think going back to the hyper-local comment, getting involved in politics on lower levels of government can be frustrating in certain ways, but it can also be a little more hopeful in the sense that the sort of levers of democracy are closer and easier to operate on lower levels. It's easy to sort of watch what's happening in Washington and to feel sort of like you lack control and like the situation is hopeless. So I think sort of local level involvement is important. And then I also think, and I'm really just naming things. I mean, the best way that this could be fixed is by the Republican Party sort of ridding itself of dangerous candidates. For the purposes of American democracy, I'm actually rooting for a stronger and better Republican Party, even if it would mean, for example, a Republican candidate winning the election this year. If that were for lack of a better word, normal Republican candidate, that would probably be good for democracy because we all have the people and the sides that we support, but a premise of democracy is that power changes hands from time to time, and that everybody has enough faith in the system that they're willing to go along with that, even if they don't like the particular set of candidates who are coming in. So, all that is to say that the tips I'm giving are things that we can do, even if they're not silver bullet. The last thing I would say is to try to sort of rid ourselves of the habit of being immediately skeptical of people who we don't agree with, even if it's hard. And then the other thing is to not call everything a threat to democracy. There might be policies that we disagree with, and that part of democracy is disagreeing with policies. But I think we shouldn't call things attacks on democracy unless they are. And I think a lot of people, probably myself included, have at times been guilty of that. But I think exaggerating the problem can lead to or overstating the extent to which particular developments are part of the problem can lead to folks who aren't paying very close attention to politics thinking, oh, this person's kind of full of it because they're saying everything is a threat to democracy, and that makes it seem like nothing is a threat to democracy. So to the extent that we can be sort of focused in the way we talk about this with others, I think that would also be helpful. So that's a quick overview.
Thank you for being here very much. I want to turn to the judiciary for a second. Having read the book Democracy in Chains,
Nancy McLean, right?
found me. And part of that was, again, a long-term effort by people to promote. And I think in that book, it talked about something like 60 or 70% of the judges in our country have been through this institute that promotes the idea of unfettered capitalism, and look what happened in Chile that tried to implement some of those things. Again, are there any similar long-term institute kinds of things trying to promote healthy democracy?
So to my knowledge, there's not a sort of liberal equivalent or a robust one of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society would probably say that the equivalent on the left is law schools. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's probably what they would say. And I'm not sure that we, in theory, we want judges to be free thinkers. But I will say that even if there isn't a Federalist Society equivalent, I think there is now renewed attention to the courts being really, really, really important. I'm not as engaged in the legal world, but I hope that the development of potential judicial nominees is something that the left is taking really seriously.
I think we have one more question.
We have one more from a virtual attendee. Could you speak a little bit more about independent voters in this polarized environment?
Sure. So my comment about independent voters is just that the number of people who stay in surveys that they're independent and the number of people is different than the number of people who actually behave as independent in the polling place. I think in part because a lot of Americans are dissatisfied with both political parties. They don't really want to necessarily attach themselves in a survey to a political party, so they say that they're independent, but they do end up voting for the same party sort of over and over again, and as a result, we often sort of overstate the number of independent voters that are actually out there. In part, that phenomenon, by the way, in part is a product of what we call negative partisanship, where people really dislike one side of the debate. So it might be that you don't love either party, so you stay independent, but you really hate the Democrats. So you're ending up voting for both every time. Having said that, swing voters are a real phenomenon, even if they're sort of smaller as a group than we often talk about. So elections ultimately come down to a really small slice of swing voters who honestly don't pay that close attention to politics, and then it also comes down to turnout. It's sort of both of those things. Which side mobilizes its committed supporters better, and which side can appeal to that tiny slice of folks.
Please, let's thank Matt for his great presentation.
Thank you all.
And thank all of you for the great questions. I just have a couple closing remarks. This is our last forum of the season. You're supposed to go on. We'll return in mid-September. In the meantime, keep in touch with your comments and ideas for future forums. Our email is forums@uucleveland.org. If you'd like to receive our weekly reminders of forums, fill out the form on the clipboard at the back table. You are welcome to attend our 10:15 a.m. Sunday service, either upstairs in the sanctuary or on our YouTube page. Reverend Randy Partain will talk about what we mean when we use spiritual words. Our music director, Mike Carney, will lead the chancel choir. To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll see you in the fall.